welcome back. This is Siegel with Sundance Flight School, and this episode we're going to be focusing on a few different things. One of the things I want to focus on is going to be doing some pre-takeoff checklists later in the video, and this video, however, is going to primarily focus on engine management, cruising, cross-country, and some basic radio navigation. And right now I just have a small flight plan loaded up here, about a 30-minute flight, give or take. And this airplane uses VOR navigation, or VORs in general, to navigate via the radios or avionics. And what is a VOR? Well, it's essentially a radio beacon that spits out a signal in every direction. And they have, it actually stands for VHF, omnidirectional range, and they have different VORs will have different ranges that they can be used for. Like, say for example, a VOR located at an airport, you may only be able to pick that up 20 miles out from that VOR, whereas if you have a VOR in the middle of nowhere or used as a navigation waypoint, that might have a 50 or 100-mile range. And you'll want to look those up on an as-case basis. Pilotnav.com is what I like to use, and you can look up any VOR pretty much within the US and Canada, and it'll be there on that website. So, we're going to be using just one VOR for this flight. It's only about a 60-mile trip, and this VOR is good for about 40 or so miles of range. So this is a pretty fairly standard, I would say, range for a VOR. Some will go to 80 to 100 miles if you have a long range unit, and some are as little as 15 to 25. It just really depends on the VOR. So if we zoom in here, right here, apologies, I forgot to turn on my nav aids. One moment. Let me open those filters up. We're going to turn airspaces and fix in position reports here, just so we can get a good idea. And here is IRW. This is a VOR DME, or VORTAC, actually, is how it's identified. And what a VOR DME can do is not only can you tune to the VOR, you can also figure out how far away from the VOR you are, which is important, and that's that DME aspect of it. What's DME? Well, DME just stands for distance measuring equipment, and it's just a great addition to have, as well as tuning with your VOR, because again, you can just know how far you're out or away from the VOR, especially because we're using this one VOR to go both directions. We're going to be heading towards the VOR after leaving Sundance here, and then once we cross over the VOR, we're going to be going from the VOR to Anadarko Municipal down here, right here. So how do we do that? So in the airplane, and I'll explain this more in depth, there is a omnidirectional bearing selector, is what the official gauge is called. Basically what you do is you put your VOR frequency you want to tune into your nav portion of your radio, or the navigation side of your radio, and then you then tune the knob to the heading that you want to fly to that VOR, and then you're going to intercept the line or track or heading, which is this line right here, to the VOR. And then once you cross the VOR, there's actually a little flag on that gauge that says TO and then from, which is to and from. If you tune the gauge, it'll know where, if you're heading towards the VOR, and then once you cross the VOR, you would then tune it to this track here, and you would be heading from or away the VOR. Now, since we have that distance measuring equipment as well, that's going to be very beneficial for us, because we can look at this and go, okay, so about 15 miles. We're about 15 miles away. If we are going from Sundance, we're about 15, 16 miles away from this VOR, as we can see here. And we need to be heading a heading of 154 right here to intercept this VOR, or to head towards the VOR and track that to heading to the VOR so we can cross it. And then once we cross that VOR, we can then go from the VOR to Anadarko Municipal. So if we look here, we see IRW is right here, which is the VOR. So that's 16 miles. That's going to be, that's going to say where our descent path is. I would ignore that for now. And so we can see from IRW here, it's going to be, let me just add this up real quick. It's going to be about 40 miles, give or take. So 42 to be exact. So we know that Anadarko is going to be about 40 miles away from the VOR. So I would say when we cross the VOR and we intercept that new heading, which is going to be heading 236 here, we need to be sure that, I would say about 10 miles out, we need to be sure that we're on frequency for Anadarko and preparing for our approach and landing. So we're about 30 miles out from the VOR, and the DME will count up. So it'll show you in nautical miles how far you are away from the VOR. So we know when we're about 30 miles away from the VOR, tracking this heading of 236 from or away the VOR, we know that we're getting kind of close to Anadarko Municipal, and we need to go ahead and start preparing for that approach. So VORs, in essence, have two functions, essentially. You can see if you're heading to the VOR or from the VOR, and on some VORs that have DME equipment on them, and assuming your aircraft that you're flying also has DME equipment, you can track how far away you are from the VOR at any given moment. As long as you can reach that VOR frequency, it'll show up. So that's just a basic introduction on how VORs work, and then we'll show the practical application, and we'll probably save this flight plan just kind of as is so we can see the magenta line. And it may take some time, getting used to VORs. They sound a lot more complex than they are. All you're really doing is just finding a heading you want to fly that heading to the VOR or from the VOR, and then if you're out of range of the VOR, you may need to find another VOR to help navigate. But that's basically all you do with the VOR, is just know what heading you want to fly to or from the VOR, and then just intercept that heading and fly to it. And in later portions of the video, we'll get into the technical details on how to intercept the VOR and such, so that you can track it down and make sure you're flying in the right direction. Alright, on to the next section. Alright, welcome back. Thanks for joining the next section of the video here. So at this point, we're going to basically go over just how to intercept the VOR, how to tune to its frequency, and what it means, like in the DME stack, and a couple other things before we get airborne here. So our active frequency that's in use is 114.10. That's going to be the IRW VORTAC, and that's what frequency we use to tune to that VOR. And if we want to change the frequency, all we got to do is hit this button right here, which just means to swap the frequencies. If we need to edit the frequency, the left side of the frequency is controlled by the inner knob, and the outer knob controls the right side. watch when we push this over to the other side. It picks up and it indicates nav, and that we're currently heading from the VOR, because if we were to go north, we would be heading away from the VOR. For the first part of our flight, we really want to be heading to the VOR, and I believe our heading's 159 or 160 or something like that, that we're going to be heading to the VOR. Yes, it's 159. And so what we would do to intercept that direction or heading is if we come down here and adjust this knob labeled OBS, which is Omni Bearing Selector, we just tune this knob here until we get to a heading of 159 or 160. And you can know what your headings are. It's because if you see this, north 3, 6, 12, 15, south 12, 24, west 30, 33. Well, this 3 here means 030, 6 means 060, east means 090, this is 120, this is 150, 180, 210, 240, 270, 300, 330, and then 360 or north. So we need to fly a heading of basically 160. So we're going to turn this knob around, and each like indentation here is 5 degrees of heading change. So here's 150, and notice how the flag changed to 2. That means we're heading towards the VOR. So this would be 155 right there, and this would be 160, which is basically the heading we need to intercept. And this shows us the direction that we would be heading to or from the VOR. When we fly over the VOR, this flag is going to be not readable for a little bit until we cross and get a mile or 2 away from the VOR. Then it'll flip over to from. And now we know we're intercepting that radial of 160 from the VOR. As we also get closer to the VOR, its track will become very sensitive. You'll see this needle here move back and forth pretty consistently. It'll get to the point where you start to get within 5 miles of the VOR that it's not worth chasing the needle at that point, because it'll be really sensitive. So you just keep flying in the general direction, and then you'll eventually cross over the VOR, and then you can re-intercept the VOR on a different heading if you need to, or however you would need to, or whatever you would plan to do with that. You know, if you needed to, if you're still flying the same heading just from the VOR, if you needed to intercept another heading or radial out from the VOR. And so that's basically how we select which radial we want to fly. With the VOR, you just do it with this gauge. Or heading, you just do it with this gauge. And then again, our DME is going to tell us how far away from the VOR we are, which is going to really help us, because when we're flying to our destination airport, which is Anadarko Municipal, we're going to be flying away from the VOR, and our destination is about 40 miles away from the VOR. So when this reads about 30 miles and we know we've already crossed the VOR and it's reading from up here, we know we're starting to get close to the airport and it's time to do our approach potentially, or make our initial call to said airport, and go ahead and start our approach procedures and land. And you can also, if you want to, you can also track the VOR in, like, do a double track of the VOR as well down here. You can also have your radial set to maybe your from heading already in advance, and then all you have to do is just reference this OBS gauge rather than the top OBS gauge. This also makes it really nice for IFR flying if you're not GPS equipped, because you can you can track a localizer or instrument landing system approach pretty easily, because you could have a VOR in one and then the ILS in the other, or vice versa. So you can have an idea of where you're at, and DME will also not just track VORs, it'll also track localizers and other stuff too. So very nice tool to have. I'm going to go ahead and just leave this second gauge static. We can also listen to the VOR if we allow that to happen. I'll show you what I mean. So if we click our nav1 option here, hear that? That's Morse code identifying what VOR that we have selected, to make sure that we're tuned to the right VOR before we go ahead and fly. I already know we're tuned to the right VOR, but if you click nav1, that will report or allow the nav1 frequency's tone to identify itself or come through the speakers. Now let's take that off real quick. If we were to do that to nav2, this is the second navigation stack, so this would be nav2. So that's just a handy tip to make sure you're tuned to the right VORs. If you know Morse code and you're wanting to identify that you've got the correct VOR tuned that way. Let's go ahead and reset the second nav radio here. And so what I like to do to make it simple for me, this is actually what holds your heading with the autopilot system, but I like to just tune my heading hold here to the what heading I want to track, more or less, and then I could just fly that heading. So that's 150. Okay, now we're tracking 160 right there. So that's about 160, just so I can keep this needle lined up with my heading indicator here. Another thing, if you watch the first video, the heading indicator will become out of sync as time passes, because a gyro is running that heading indicator, and the gyro doesn't stay consistent as it's being used. So you want to look at your compass and also check the deviation chart over here, but you want to use your compass and make sure that you just, I would say once every 20 minutes or so, just take a look at your compass and then make sure that your heading indicator is reporting the same information. Keep in mind, if this is turning left, that means the heading indicator is turning right, and vice versa. So they turn in opposite directions of each other. Keep that in mind when you're adjusting your heading indicator, so you don't adjust it backwards by mistake. Because that can happen, and it's very easy, even for me, who's done it before. It can be pretty easy to trip up if you're not paying attention. And but that's pretty much it. The only other thing I would like to do real quick before we go ahead and get going is do our magneto checks and do our pre-flight takeoff checklist real quick, or not pre-flight, excuse me, our pre-takeoff checklist. And to go ahead and do that real quick, we're just going to advance the mixture to full rich. We want to do our magneto check here real quick. And then what we're going to do is, once that's at full rich, we want to run the engine up to 1800 RPMs. Now, what's a mag check? Well, a mag check is what's known as a magneto check. Well, what's a magneto check? Well, a magneto check makes sure that our ignition system is functioning correctly and that we're pretty much safe to fly. You know, like our spark plugs aren't fouled out, so where they can't burn any fuel and then the engine dies. So we want to do that just to make sure our engine's operating healthy. So you see this magneto switch down here. It has both left, right, and then off. That's the left magneto. That's the right magneto. Your system has two independent magneto ignition systems, because if one of them fails, at least you still have another magneto that's delivering spark or ignition to the engine. Yes, that means planes have two spark plugs per cylinder instead of one spark plug per cylinder. So we should see a noticeable drop. We're going to go ahead and go to the left mag. Yeah, that's a fairly noticeable drop. It's about 200. Let's say we're right on the edge of... It should be fine. You really want about 125 RPM drop. We might have fouled the plugs a little bit just by sitting and idling for a while. Then the next thing we want to do is check our carb heat. Pull that out, just make sure we've got a small reduction in power, because carburetor heat, if it's functioning, it will do that, because the mixture will be richer than if carb heat is not on. So that's the case. We know we're good. Oil temperature is looking good. Oil pressure is obviously in the green, so we know the engine's not about to explode on takeoff. And that's pretty much it for the mag check. Let's go ahead and pull the power back to idle. I'm going to bump it up a little bit here, and then re-lean our mixture back out. And the next thing we just want to make sure we have on is our landing lights, our nav lights, and then strobes as required. I usually like leaving those off, just so to not blind people with strobes, unless it's absolutely needed. But that's up to you. That's really personal preference. Some people like having the strobe lights on, so it's really up to you. And then just make sure your flaps are set correctly. You know, if you want 10 degrees of flaps for your takeoff, just make sure it's set to 10 degrees and whatnot. We've got nearly 5,000 feet of runway, so I mean we're at like 1,200 feet basically above the ground. So we don't need flaps for the takeoff. We're just gonna wing it flapless, which is because we got plenty of room to do that. But alright, I will see you in the next segment. We're going to go ahead and do the takeoff roll. And then we'll see you in the air and show you how to really intercept and fly that radial, track, heading, whatever you want to call it, so we know how to fly to and from the VOR. Alright, thanks for sticking by. See you in a bit. Alright, so we're about to do the takeoff roll. I just wanted to mention something real quick. Make sure your elevator trim is set to the takeoff position here before taking off as well, because if you're trimmed way down, you're going to need more back pressure, and if you're trimmed way up, the plane's almost going to want to stall when you're getting off on takeoff. So just make sure your trim is set before you depart. Just make sure that way you're not expecting, you know, any weird deviation in trim pressure or back pressure that you need on your yoke. You know exactly what it's going to do and how it's going to respond. Alright, let's go ahead and get on the runway here. Alright, we're going to be departing on 3.6, and then we'll basically be doing a 180 or downwind departure out of here. Let's go ahead, mixtures full rich, power set. Go ahead and release those brakes. Engine instruments in the green, oil pressure and oil temp is good. Airspeed is alive. Alright, a little bit of crosswind correction and just a very slight back pressure on that yoke, and we're up. Pitch for that 70 knots, just for best climb. Okay, so how do we intercept that VOR? So, as you can see, that needle is kind of off to our left. So we need to turn left to intercept it once we're on our heading. Because what we don't want to be is 50 miles laterally away from the VOR on the track, but 50 miles laterally away from the track. Alright, we're going to go ahead and start turning for our crosswind here. Pitch that nose up. Alright, as you can see, we're about to intercept that VOR because we're heading left of 160 here. As you can see, we're about to intercept it. I'm going to pop open the VFR map here so you can see. Alright, now we've basically intercepted it, so it's time to turn to our heading because it's getting into the middle here, pretty much. Alright, there we go. And that's how you intercept the VOR. And then you just fly that heading that you are tracking. Now, it's not going to be perfect because this is a radio, so there's going to be some separation from the actual track the farther out we are. That's why we're a little bit to the left of the actual track. But as you can see, that's how you intercept it. And if you want to intercept it, you normally want to do it at a 45-degree angle, give or take. So if you're heading, like, say, south or 180, you want to really intercept that at heading 150 and wait for that to turn into the middle and then fly that heading as indicated, as you tuned in your OBS gauge and how you have marked on your heading indicator if it allows you to mark it in that way. Let's go ahead and trim the plane out for 70 knots here just to make our lives a little easier. I'm going to go ahead and hide that map. But I'll pull it up. And if you're new to VORs, don't be afraid to use the map to make sure you're going the right direction, okay? VOR navigation is tricky, and it took me a while to master. Took me a while to master. So if you need to use that that as your reference or guide, by all means do so. So you can see we're slipping off the track a little bit. It's kind of going to the right a little bit, so I'm just going to adjust very slightly. We're also getting within that 10-mile range of the VOR, where it becomes very sensitive. And so it's going to be wanting to show off track and on track pretty consistently. Don't chase the needle too much. If you're like this close to the VOR and it starts really going haywire, just keep flying the direction you're flying. You will cross it. Alright, we're at 3,500 feet. We really need to start leaning the mixture out above 3,000 feet. Now, how do we lean the mixture? So, I like looking at engine RPM. And if we move over here real quick, see how we're gaining RPM? And now it's starting to drop. That means we're too lean, so we need to richen up a little bit. And that is how I tell what mixture I need to be at. There are other methods that you can use. You can listen to the engine noise and hear what the engine is doing. That is a perfectly valid way to intercept or to lean the engine out. You just want to lean the engine out in general for best power rather than economy. That's the real reason you're leaning the engine out. It's not because you want to save fuel. It's because you don't want to foul the plugs out. And the air gets thinner as you climb, so you have to lean how much fuel is mixed with said air, so you don't have a rich fuel mixture or overly rich fuel mixture going on. I'm going to probably let the plane climb to about 5,500 feet here. As you see, that VOR is getting kind of sensitive. It's not super sensitive yet, but it'll get a lot more sensitive than this here in a bit. Believe you me, it will definitely get more sensitive. Got that nice airspeed going. Got about 600 feet per minute. at over 4,000 feet. I mean, that's a pretty good climb rate, I would say. I mean, we do have 50% fuel in our tank, so we have a little bit more fuel than what we need for our tanks here. Okay, we're recentered on our track, so we'll go ahead and let that go back to the heading we were flying. Here, there we go. Alright. Alright, we're starting to reach 5,500 feet, so let's start pulling the power back a little bit. Not too bad, just a little bit. We'll really start pulling it back here for our cruise once we get to about 100 feet within here. Okay, let's go ahead and really start pulling that power back. About 2,300 RPM-ish is where you want to be. So, $2,300 RPM is about where you want to be. Yeah, see, we're starting to get really close to that VOR, and it's becoming super sensitive. We're under 10 miles now. That's going to continue to get sensitive, and as you're crossing the VOR, if you're slightly off the track any bit, that needle is going to move all the way to the left or right as you're crossing over the VOR, and you'll see that flag just be invalidated as you're flying over, like it's almost like a checker mark, more or less. So right now I know we're pretty close to the VOR, so I'm just going to fly the heading that we were normally flying. Go ahead and get this plane trimmed here. While we're waiting, I'm going to just reduce power slightly. Alright. There's Will Rogers World down to our left there, and that's basically where we're going to be intercepting that VOR here in just a moment. So we have a visual reference too. It's good to have navigation backups in case you don't have a radio or other way to verify where you're going. You can see we're getting pretty close to that VOR. This is what I mean by don't chase the needle. Don't chase the needle, because as you get really close, it's going to want to intercept you on that exact track, and it's going to get pretty funky. I'm surprised it's not been more funky yet, but it's going to get pretty funky here in just a minute. Go. And now I believe our from heading is 235. Let's see. Yeah, 235 is going to be our from heading here in just a second. Okay, we're getting really close to flying on that VOR. Alright. See that needle starting to move? That's because we're about to fly over that VOR. Okay, yeah, we're within a mile, so we're flying over the VOR right now. And then you're going to see that flag go from to from here in just a second once we actually cross over that VOR. Yep, there it goes. See how it's invalidated right now? It just like reset. That's because we're crossing it. Now we're heading from the VOR. So now at this point, what we need to do is intercept 235. So if we look here, there's 240 right here. Then just do 1, 2, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now we've got 235 plugged in, and then we just do the same over here. Just do the same over here. Real quick. Say that's fairly close to our track that we need. Alright. And now we're going to go ahead and put the plane into a right turn. Now keep in mind the track that we currently have is for the right. So what does that mean, right? Well, what it means is that we need to be intercepting that at a 45-degree angle. If I can open that map up again so I can show you in a visual manner, like in real time. See how we're kind of off the track a little bit? What we're going to be doing is heading in a 45-degree angle to get on the right track here. So I'd say we need to go about west, give or take. That'll give us a nice, 45-degree entry, give or take, into there, right about there. That's going to give us this nice 45-degree entry into the track we need to be on. And then, as we intercept the track here, you will see that you will see that that needle start to move kind of over back to the center, and then once it does, we just fly the heading that we're tracking from the VOR. Now that we're heading from the VOR, here's the deal, right? Now that we're heading from the VOR, we need to, about 30 miles out, we need to start looking for the field. And if we were talking with ATC, talk with tower, or if the airport has a CTAF frequency, we would talk on that CTAF frequency and announce our intentions. We'll get to more about communications and other things in another video. But just keep that in mind, as you're learning how to fly the plane. About 10 miles out, you want to start preparing in a 152 at least. Your entry in, your approach in, and when you're going to land, more or less. Now keep in mind as well, we are intercepting from IRW's perspective and not our route's perspective. So we might be a little bit off to the side of the track, because you can see IRW is right there. So just keep that in mind. If it's not coming in immediately, it will. If it's doing this to you, and you're like, what do you mean it's not moving, it's staying stuck at that right position, this track is not going to be 100% accurate. It's an estimate, and again, we're reliant on the VOR, not that direct track. Now you can see that line is starting to move. And we'll just wait for it to get right and nice on that center line. So then we know we're on the track, basically. We know we're on the track at that point. And we're heading from the VOR. And again, this airport is about 40 miles away from the VOR. So once we're about 30 miles out, we'll definitely want to make sure that we are starting our approach into land and doing other things that we'd want to do, like our pre-landing checklist and a couple other things like that, just before we are coming in, just to get all that stuff out of the way. Okay, now we've got that intercepted, so let's go ahead and might have blown through the intercept slightly because we're still really, really close. So I'm just going to go slightly, maybe like 10 degrees to the left of our heading real quick. Just get back on that intercept. And then, there we go. Alright. We'll just fly that heading, fly that track out once we've got it intercepted. And if you get off course for whatever reason, it's just the same thing. Just fly 45 degrees and whatever it's off course. If the needle is to the right, 45 degrees off to the right, fly 45 degrees of your assigned course. And then if it's off to the left, you know, just fly 45 degrees off of your assigned heading that way as well. Got some nice clouds today. It's beautiful in Oklahoma. I've got live weather turned on, and it's pretty much how it looks outside right now. So, yeah. And then keep in mind, as you move away from the VOR, the needle is less sensitive. So, if you're like, say, 80 miles out from the VOR, and you've got to intercept the track, it might not be as responsive as our intercept just was. Might need to change my... Yeah, the heading indicator looks accurate. I might need to change my course a little bit. But we're flying basically heading 240, so... This ETA is also going to climb as we fly away from the VOR, or continue to fly away from the VOR, so just kind of keep that in mind as well. As we continue to fly away, it'll climb. We'll also get to the autopilot in another episode. I kind of just wanted to leave it off because you really want to get good with just flying the plane and just getting comfortable with straight and level flight before using the autopilot. You know, making sure you're putting in proper aileron and rudder corrections and such. We'll probably do like coordinated turns and such in another video, just so because you have what's called adverse yaw, and that can affect your turning performance. And it just, you don't have to. It's not like it's a hardcore requirement in the 152. It's really not. But it's usually best practice to add rudder correction and pull on the yoke slightly. Because when you're turning, your wings aren't loaded evenly, right? So when you're turning, one wing may have more lift than the other, and it's going to cost you a little bit in airspeed. Because you're putting way more load on one wing than the other when you're doing a turn. Versus straight and level flight where both wings are pretty much just straight and level. Just gonna let the plane turn slightly to the left because I think we're. And you may need to make minor corrections. It's okay to chase the needle a little bit. You may need to make minor corrections to your course as you're flying. Keep that in mind. I have a knob that I have set up to adjust the heading indicator, but if you don't, this is how you do it. You just turn this side of the heading indicator, whether left or right, as you need. Or if it's, you don't have a knob and it's really hard to take your hands off the controls and reach down there because you're not sitting there in real life. You can't just reach through the screen. The D key will also adjust your heading as well automatically for you. But I'm going to go ahead and turn that map off for now, and we'll just fly according to the VOR gauge here. Let me make sure I hide my mouse. There we go. Get that annoying little watermark. I wish there was a way you could disable that watermark. I'm sure there is. I'm just probably technologically inept. Man, it's beautiful. I'm tempted to take some screenshots. Got some wind farms down there, looks like. Pretty cool, pretty cool. Now, since we're in the cruise, this is a good time to look at any information that you have available for your airport. So I'm going to type in the identifier here. I'm going to look on my phone here real quick. let's see. Oh, I'm trying to not fly the course. Not looking at the screen, so if it seems like I'm overcorrecting a little bit, I'm just wasn't looking at the screen. Apologies. Okay. The reason why the plane keeps wanting to pull to the left is a thing called P factor, and I don't have another passenger in the seat here. So what's going on is, since I don't have the other person in the seat, I'm just flying solo. The plane naturally wants to pull to the left because of the torque that the motor is, or the torque of the propeller essentially is applying to the motor. And you can correct through that with ailerons or rudder. I'm kind of doing a little bit of a mix of both. Nice and leaned out here though. I would say this is pretty realistic for a Cessna 152. We're kind of high in the air. We're at 5,500 feet, basically. Which is, some would say, oh, it's not that high. If for a 152, you're usually flying, unless you live in the mountains, at 2,500 to 3,500 feet. You're usually not flying that high in the air. So I would say this is fairly high. So, let's take a look at some of the information for the airport we're going to here. So we're going to F68, which is, again, is Anadarko. Okay. Let's see. And then that's McAllister. Let's look at the. Okay, so we've got 3,100 feet. So that's going to be plenty of room for us to land in this 152. Really, 2,000 is plenty for this plane. Just make sure we don't balloon on final, and we should be fine. And then take a look at, let's see. Oh, probably time to readjust my heading. Let me take a look. No, that looks pretty correct. But they're off the track a little bit, so let's go ahead and just fly. Maybe like 10 degrees, like I said, just off. 10 degrees off your assigned heading, basically. Sometimes your heading indicator won't perfectly line up with the radios, and that can just be due to interference and other things as well, so just keep that in mind. Sometimes it's not 100% perfect science. It's basically it's GPS before GPS was a thing. This is how you would navigate around. And before VORs, you would just use visual navigations and a map. I mean, there's some pilots who still fly that way, you know. It's like, okay, man, you do you, but I at least like having VORs if I'm in an area I'm not familiar with, which I'm familiar with Oklahoma, but you know. If you're not from Oklahoma, then how do you get around, you know what I mean? Without knowing the area. Okay, so we are almost, we need to go about 5 more miles. Let's see, let's go ahead and stop that bank there. So basically we're going to a 1,300 foot runway. So I'm going to do the pattern altitude at about 2,300 feet. So this airport's about 40 miles out from the VR, I think 42 specifically. But you want to give yourself a couple miles of room. So say it's 40 miles out. And we descend at 500 feet per minute. So we're basically going to descend 3,000 feet in 6 minutes. Is what we want. more or less. And if we're going 100 knots, just say, for example, at 1,000 feet a minute, that would be 1,000 feet per nautical mile, basically. So yeah, I say we descend about 10 minutes out, give or take, or start our descent about 10 minutes out, give or take. Yeah, that way we just have we have about 5 or 6 miles of room, more or less. But yeah, as you can see, we're following the track pretty good. We're still flying the track. We're flying what the VOR is recommending. So we're going to start looking for F68 here, Anadarko Municipal, here in just a minute. We're getting kind of close. We're about 28 miles out from the VOR. So we're going to start looking for Anadarko here before too long. Hopefully it's rendered in, and it doesn't do the infamous FSX 10-mile pop. There it is. I think Asobo fixed most of that, though, so let's go ahead and start looking for it. Yeah. It's going to be to our left, so somewhere in this area is probably where it's going to be at. I don't think it's quite rendered in yet, though. Which is okay. Sometimes it takes Microsoft Flight Sim a little bit. It might be that over there as well. We just need to keep our eyes peeled and look for a giant asphalt runway. Alright, I'm going to start to reduce power here. There's the city of Anadarko. So that's the airport right there. Got it in sight, right there. It's right there. Cool. I was like, I know it's really close to the city, so. We're going to start our descent to pattern altitude here. And our goal is about 500 feet per minute, I would say at about 80 knots. Say probably 10 degrees of flaps as well. Ooh, okay, hold on. Ooh, yep. Those flaps add drag, but they also add lift. About 1800 RPM is right. Yeah, that's a pretty good descent profile, I would say. That's what we got going on here. We're probably going to enter a left downwind here for runway 36, maybe a right downwind. We could do a right downwind. But I kind of want to do a flyby past the city, more or less. And this is where we'd definitely be like on CTAP, being like, 8 miles out. Cessna. We'd be reporting our position in traffic on CTAF because I don't think this is towered. But we'll get to communications in a later video, as mentioned earlier. The difference between a right downwind, just in case for specification, like if a controller asks you fly right downwind for runway blah 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 blah, the right downwind. Oh, and ignore that VOR, that gauge, because we have the runway in sight. We know where we're going. Here's the deal, right, with that. They mean if you turn left, that's a left traffic pattern. If you turn right, that's a right traffic pattern. So if you have to turn from downwind base, then short final, and you have to do a left turn each time, that's what they mean by left traffic or left downwind. they don't mean you're entering on the right side of the runway, because you're not from that perspective. Because if you're on downwind of the runway you're landing at, you're actually on the opposite direction. You're heading the opposite direction that you're landing at. So this runway, I believe, is runway 35 and 17, which is basically north and south. And we're going to be landing on runway 35 here in just a minute. Okay. I think we'll just probably descend through this whole thing. Probably should have started the descent a little bit earlier, actually. But yeah, there's Anadarko, Oklahoma, for you guys if you ever want to come out here. I mean, kind of a small town, small city. Yeah, we're a little bit above pattern altitude. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and enrich in our mixture here, because we're about to drop below 3,000 feet. And there's Anadarko Municipal right to our left here. Right here, which is about 1,300 feet. Go ahead and pull the power just a little more, just to get a slightly more aggressive descent rate in. We don't want to go too aggressive, but up to 1,000 feet is okay. I wouldn't say we're overly high, I just don't want to be on short final overly high. Alright. Might make an extended downwind here. That's a beautiful river. I'm trying to remember the name of it. Alright. Let's go ahead. We're going to enter the downwind here. We're about a couple hundred feet above our pattern altitude, but that's okay. Alright, we're at a good downwind. Let's go ahead and introduce some power back. But I'm just going to keep the 10 degrees of flaps in and try to keep it at 80 knots, kind of like how we were having it, more or less, because we're just going to fly a short traffic pattern here, and that's pretty much it. Alright, let's go ahead and get some of that power back. Because now all I have to do is just give it enough power to keep it at 80, more or less, or 80-ish knots. Yeah, I don't think anybody's landing here. Oh, we got some AI on the runway, though. That's lovely. I hope, I hope it's clear when we land. I wonder what they're doing. And there's runway 35 at the end, very end there. So we'll just fly a short extended downwind a little bit. Alright, let's go ahead and cut our power back. And then we'll start turning our base. We'll probably just turn into final here, to be honest with you. Alright. Correction there. Oh, we are a little bit. Pitch up just a slight bit. Alright. Let's go ahead and add 20 degrees of flaps now. And we're going to pitch for about 65 knots, give or take. Let's set the, maybe 60. Probably more like 60, to be honest. Pitch for about 60. Got a slight crosswind coming in from the right here. Trim as needed. And we're on short final. We're just going to leave the power off. Alright, here we go. There we go. Get that crosswind correction in. Alright. So, I'm not going to taxi down this whole runway. That's a pretty long taxiway. What we're going to do is a thing called back taxiing. We're just going to spin this sucker around. Alright. And then go ahead and, since we're on the ground now, go ahead and lean the engine out for taxi and parking, because we don't need to be full rich with the engine basically being at near idle. Really don't need that much. Oh, looks like we got some people parked here. Okay, we're clear of the runway. Let's go ahead and get those flaps up. Alright. Oh, we got someone helping us to park today? Yeah, we do. Alright, let's... Well, how very nice. Okay. Set that parking brake. Alright, cool. So, quick recap. Above 3,000 feet, above ground level, or not above ground level, but above sea level, we want to make sure we're leaning the mixture out for best performance. We can do that by making sure the engine seems like it's performing well and healthy. And then we can also just make sure, that the RPMs are matching, for our expected performance. If we lean and the RPMs start to drop, that means we're too lean and we need to richen up the mixture a few turns. And that's pretty much it. I'm going to shut this landing light off so I don't blind this woman with my bright LEDs. She's probably already been blind, to be honest, but... yeah, and then why this is also not picking up the VOR as well is because we're just outside of range. That VOR that I used had about 40 miles of range, and we're just a couple miles outside of that range, so we've lost the VOR. But I knew it was close enough that I would be able to see the airport before we lost the VOR. So keep that in mind as well. That's why it's no longer picking it up. VORs do have a limited range, and different VORs will have different ranges. You'll want to check them out on pilotnav.com and see what their range is. And also, dependent on altitude, that can also affect their range. So just kind of keep that in mind as well. And only other things that I would really say is just make sure don't chase the needle. And this is not an exact science. So if you find that whatever heading you have selected is not 100% accurate, adjust it a little bit. Because sometimes the radio waves and the heading indicator and the compass don't align, and they're just slightly all off of each other. Just keep that needle centered. Don't feel like you have to chase the needle, especially when you're within 5 miles of that VOR. Don't chase the needle. If you know you're close enough, it will, as you're crossing, especially as you're about to cross the VOR, it's going to go like off to one side and then shut itself off while you're over the VOR until you've crossed it, and then it'll say you're going from the VOR. So just keep that in mind as well when you're doing it. Don't feel like you have to chase the needle or anything like that either, because you don't. You just want to make sure that you keep that centered. To intercept that course or heading or radial, just do it at a 45-degree angle. So if I have a heading of east and this needle here is showing off to the left, I want to intercept that at 060 until that's centered, and then turn east to track that radial. And then the same thing with if we were tracking east and it was all the way over here, or even just slightly off to the right, we would want to track heading 120 for a little bit until that's back on the center line, and then go back on our initial, or what course we were going on initially. And then, but that's pretty much it. And then just trim and lean the mixture as you need. That's what I would really say. Just trim and mixture as you need. Just get the plane as kind of docile as you can. It was absolutely enjoyable for me to fly. The plane was very well behaved with the trim wheel. I wonder if that's an update improvement, because I know previously the trim wheel was pretty stinking sensitive. So, hats off to the JP Logistics team for this wonderful Cessna 152 mod. I really cannot thank them enough for what they've provided for Flight Simulator. And they have a working DME stack. Who would have thought, within a year of Flight Sim coming out, we would have such a nice airplane. I mean, really, it's a very, very nice airplane. And if you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to let me know. And like always, I'll put the link to the mod and our Discord in the description. And thanks for sticking with us so far. Have a good one. As always, stay safe, stay flying.